be to God. Well, for the last 2 weeks, we have read from Matthew's Gospel, Jesus' parables about the kingdom of heaven. Last week, it was like seed sown on different kinds of ground. This week, it is like a planter who plants good seed. And next week, we'll have the story about the grain of mustard seed. Now, there's one thing that's unique to Matthew, and it's this. He loves any parable that has to do with judgment. Of all the gospel writers, Matthew is the only one who speaks about the end of the world. Matthew is the only one who mentions a furnace with weeping and gnashing of teeth. Matthew is the only one who writes about the wise and foolish virgins, or the division of the sheep from the goats, or today's parable about the wheat and the weeds. Of all the gospel writers, Matthew is the one who wants things to be black and white, good and bad. He's the only one where people are faithful or wicked, blessed or cursed. And this is something that he has in common with a lot of Christians today. Never mind that there seem to be a lot of weeds in the world right now. Hang in there. Be patient, he says. When the last day comes, the wheat will be vindicated and the weeds will go up in smoke. Maybe a comforting message to some, but to others it has the opposite effect. Matthew may have been clear that there are only two kinds of people in the world, the wheat and the weeds, the good and the bad, but it is a clarity that escapes most of us. Even the characters in the popular Harry Potter books reveal themselves to have both good and bad characteristics. Albus Dumbledore, great wizard, wonderful supporter of Harry and all his trials, also has some bad characteristics involved in him. And of course, the nasty Draco Malfoy, who was very much a supporter of the evil wizard Voldemort, he ends up having some good qualities in the end too. We too, all of us I think, have encountered people who have both wheat and weeds in them. Ourselves are made up of both wheat and weeds. People we know, people we don't know, in our neighbors, in our world, we see constantly the example that people are a mixture of both good and bad, and not just one or the other. So this business about gathering and burning the weeds tend to make me a little bit nervous. And the burning question for me is, well, which am I then? Am I a weed? Or am I wheat? Am I blessed? Or am I cursed? Now, the lovely thing about parables is that they rarely answer such questions, or at least not directly. However much we might want parables to read like black and white rules, they behave more like dreams or poems, delivering their message in images that talk more to our hearts than to our heads. Parables are mysterious, and left alone, they teach us something different every time we hear them. But according to Matthew, Jesus does not leave today's parable alone any more than Matthew had Jesus explain the parable last week. Today, Jesus gives his disciples the key to this parable. He is the sower, the field is the world, the weeds belong to the devil, the wheat belong to the kingdom of God. Everything equals something else with nothing left over. And when you hear it all laid out like that, you wonder, well, why didn't Jesus just say that in the first place? Not that it matters much, except to remind us about how much we love explanations, which are, after all, so much easier than mysteries. A parable washes over you like a wave full of life, but an explanation, well, an explanation lets you know where you stand. An explanation gives you something to put on the church sign for Sunday morning, like, don't let the weeds take over. And that's the message that the servants in this parable take to heart. They are so eager to please the owner. They see something wrong in their boss's field and they want to fix it. Do you want us to go and gather the weeds? They want to be faithful servants. But the sower takes a risk, an unnecessary risk. He's reluctant to let his servants weed the field because the weeds look so much like wheat that he fears they will uproot the wheat along with the weeds. Sometimes it's hard to tell a good plant from a bad one, isn't it? I suppose we've all had the experience of uprooting raspberry plants by mistake or protecting something interesting that turns out to be thistle. I don't know what makes us think that we're any smarter about ourselves or about others. We are so quick to judge, as if we were sure that we knew the difference between wheat and weeds, between good seed and bad seed, but that is seldom the case. Turn us loose with our garden tools, and there's no telling what we'll chop down and what we will spare. Meaning, to be good servants, we go out to do battle with the weeds, and we end up chopping down wheat. Or else we don't start chopping, because we have the good sense to listen to the sower, whose orders sound foolish. Leave the weeds and the wheat alone. Let them both grow together, he says, letting us know that he does not share our appetite for a pure crop, for a neat field, for an efficient operation. He lets us know that growth interests him more than perfection, and that he is willing to risk fat weeds in order to get fat wheat. And when we try to help him out a little bit, he lets us know that our timing is off, not to mention our judgment, and that he does, after all, own the field, and we do not. So here's another version of the parable of the wheat and the weeds, written by Barbara Brown Taylor. One afternoon, in the middle of growing season, a bunch of farmhands decided to surprise their boss and weed his favorite wheat field. But no sooner had they begun their work than they began to argue. First about which of the wheat-looking things were really weeds, and then what about the rest of the weeds? Did the Queen Anne's lace pose a real threat to the wheat, or could it stay for decoration? And the blackberries? They would be ripe in just a week or two, but they were, after all, weeds. Or were they? And the honeysuckle. Oh, it seemed a shame to pull up anything that smelled so sweet. About the time they had gotten around to debating the purple asters, the boss showed up and ordered them out of his field. And dejected, they laughed. And back at the barn, the boss took their machetes away from them, poured them some lemonade, and made them sit down where they could watch the way the light moved across the field. At first, all they could see were the weeds and what a messy field it was, and what a discredit to them and to their profession. But as the summer wore on, they marveled at the profusion of growth. Tall wheat surrounded by tall goldenrod and ragweed and black-eyed Susans. The weeds and the poison ivy flourished alongside the Cherokee roses and the milkweed, and it was a mess, but a glorious mess. And when it had all bloomed and ripened and gone to seed, the reapers came. Carefully and gently and expertly, they gathered the wheat for bread and made the rest, the weeds, into bricks for the oven where the bread was baked. And the fire that the weeds made was excellent, and the flour that the wheat made was excellent. And when the harvest was over, the owner called them all together, the farmhands and the reapers and the neighbors, and broke bread with them. Bread that was the final result of that whole messy, glorious, mixed-up field. And they all agreed that it was like no bread any of them had ever tasted before, and that it was very, very good. Let those who have ears to hear listen.